Hi, here I've got 5 ukuleles in 5 different tunings, and in this video we're going to look at those tunings, how they relate to old sheet music, and why what we think of as standard tuning might not be so standard after all. So before I move these out of shot and get comfortable on the sofa and play them, I'll just run through what we have. On the far end we have the lowest pitched, which is a baritone, tuned to the chord of G, or G6 we would say, but usually we'd call that G tuning, D, G, B, E. Next to that I have a tenor, more about that particular tenor in a moment, but that one is tuned to B flat, which is F, B flat, D, G. That one's a little lower than this next one, which is our familiar old GCEA or C tuning. Then I've got A, D, F sharp, B or D tuning, and finally B flat, E flat, G, C or E flat tuning. They're gradually getting higher in pitch. So here I am with our old friend, the soprano uke, tuned G, C, E, A. I've got a high fourth, but really for this video, whether you have a high or a low fourth doesn't matter. I have a high fourth on all of these, except for my baritone. You might think because GCEA is in all of the teaching materials, and if you go to ukulele workshops at festivals, everyone will be playing that shape and calling it a C chord. But it wasn't always that way. This little uke, for example, this little harmony, is tuned to A, D, F sharp, B, which is the equivalent of the second fret being held down on my GCEA tuned ukulele. It's a tone higher. This tuning you will find in many old ukulele tutor books. And if you can find any of those, and lots of them are scanned and on the internet, they will tell you at the beginning that this is how to tune your ukulele. If you are one of those players who plays in the style of George Formby, you'll often find you'll be playing a ukulele in A, D, F sharp, B, and some of the players who come from that school of playing still stick with that. If you came up through the Canadian school system, you also might tune A, D, F sharp, B, and I know that James Hill used to tune A, D, F sharp, B. I don't know if he still does now, but he certainly used to back in the day tune A, D, F sharp, B. It's also a very common tuning throughout Europe. So lots of players who have been playing a long time in European countries might still stick to A, D, F sharp, B. Here's a little bit of some sheet music that says at the very beginning, tune your uke A, D, F sharp, B. And also, interestingly, some of the sheet music talks about tuning to, say, G, C, E, A, but it does it from the point of view of this one, A, D, F sharp, B, being the standard, and you having to change your tuning from this down to G, C, E, A. I'm going to keep on going up in pitch now, because what I have here, this lovely little camp ukulele that was made for me by my friend Professor Chris, is tuned up another half step, another semitone above A, D, F sharp, B, which puts it in B flat, E flat, G, C. That's really quite high. But again, this was a common tuning and you'll find it referenced on sheet music. Sometimes it will tell you to tune A, D, F sharp, B and put a capo on the first fret. And that might be because either they would expect everyone to already be in A, D, F sharp, B tuning, or possibly because, well, the strings do start to get quite tight in this tuning, and I don't suppose they would want people's ukuleles to explode. I have every confidence in Professor Chris as a builder that this uke will stand up to this tuning. So we've gone up from what we would consider standard tuning now, C tuning, up to D and up to E flat. Let's go down from C tuning and see what we have. Well, if we go all the way down, obviously we end up with the baritone. Here's a baritone. Now this particular baritone has a low fourth, but as I said earlier, that doesn't really matter. The point is, it is tuned to D, G, B, E. And it forms a G6 chord, and we'd often call this G tuning for that reason. But I had one more uke. Now this tenor, this is a Boozy and Hawkes tenor, but it's branded Boozy and Hawkes, but it's pretty obviously a Bruco, a German-made tenor, that was made for a company who then put their own the brand on it, the shop, the import or whatever. That was quite a common thing to do. It still is, in fact. This tenor is tuned halfway, really, more or less halfway between my soprano and my baritone. It's a tone lower than the soprano, and it's a tone and a half higher than the baritone. F, B flat, D, G. An interesting aside tuning-wise with tenor ukuleles is in the Martin catalogue of 1929, the year they introduced the tenor ukulele into their range, it actually says with heavy strings it can be tuned like a guitar, with lighter strings regular ukulele tuning can be used. In other words, they were saying that their tenor ukulele could either be tuned as their soprano and concert ukuleles or as a baritone ukulele. Except, of course, the baritone ukulele did not exist in 1929. Nobody's quite sure exactly, there's argument about it and there are no actual patents, but the late 40s is going to be the earliest baritone uke, whether it was a favilla or a vega, and there's lots of arguments about that I'm not going to get into. But in 1929 there wouldn't have been a baritone ukulele, so they talk of it as guitar tuning, but that would be DGBE, same as the baritone uke. So it was certainly part of their intention when the tenor uke came out for potentially it to be tuned lower in pitch. So I've now got 5 ukuleles, all tuned differently, but this is important. The relative tuning is the same. In other words, I can play the same shapes on all of these, play the same songs, so to speak, using the same finger shapes. And unless you have perfect pitch or some other means of a reference pitch, like somebody to sing along with, another ukulele that you know you've tuned, or an electronic tuner or whatever, you wouldn't know that I wasn't playing C, F and G7. In fact, I could pick this ukulele up and play most of the songs in my set and sing them, and it would never really occur to me that I wasn't tuned up to GCEA, unless I found it was starting to get a bit hard to sing some of the songs at the bottom end of my range. So these tunings aren't the sort of alternative tunings that sometimes people use to get particular effects, particular sounds, to extend the range of the instrument, things like that. They're just the same tuning moved up or moved down. So why is that sheet music telling us to do this, and why would we want to do it? Well, it's fairly obvious from a lot of the early sheet music that I've got and ukulele tutors that A, D, F sharp, B was considered the standard. And we can see that because on some of this sheet music, it's talking about tuning to GCEA, but telling you to tune your uke, which would of course have been A, D, F sharp, B, down to C. And also the ukulele instructor books that show a picture of the ukulele and point to the strings and say things like A, D, F sharp, B. And that standardizing to C has only really happened pretty recently with this ukulele boom, the current one. So that sheet music telling you to tune your ukulele, well, the thing is, the sheet music itself probably already existed. It had already been engraved, ready to print, and that's quite a difficult thing to do when you're dealing with not just typing words, but writing out sheet music. So some of those arrangements might have existed without any ukulele chords, and people started to want to add ukulele chords to those piano arrangements because it was becoming the thing to have. And if people bought sheet music to play around their piano, if somebody in the house had a ukulele, they could strum along. But if the piano was already arranged in a key like E flat or B flat, then the chords for the ukulele would be quite difficult. Now, of course, I'm not saying that people should not learn to play in all 12 keys, but we were talking about a time of self-made music at home where most people could read a little music, most people could play a little piano, they could do just every day they would sing together and make music together in the home. It wasn't necessarily something people were doing as a profession. Therefore, you needed to make it accessible to people. So what would happen is the piano arrangement would be in E flat and the chord progression would be awful on the ukulele, unless you tuned your ukulele to a different pitch. And if you tuned it like my little camp uke all the way up to E flat, you would, in essence, as far as you looking at shapes on your fingerboard be concerned, you'd be playing in C. If the song was in B flat, you could take this one and play it as if you were playing in C, and you'd be playing in the key of B flat. People were employed to make ukulele arrangements to go with this, and it's fairly common to see the name May Singy Breen. I know on a lot of my vintage sheet music her name crops up. She was responsible for figuring out how to add these chord diagrams and what tuning they will be in and what would sound best and what would be the best thing for the player. Many of the diagrams for the chords don't have a name above them, and that's because it's not really important what the chord name is, and that could even be confusing because that, to me, looks like a C chord. My brain sees that and thinks C chord. And if I'm changing tuning on different songs, I don't want to have to think, oh, that looks like a C chord, but because I'm tuned here, that's now a B flat. That's a whole level of unnecessary complication that these tunings are trying to get rid of. They're trying to say, you just play those shapes you're familiar with. Don't worry that it's in B flat. Just as a guitarist might slap a capo on and play using the shapes of C and D and A and G and things like that, familiar shapes that they know. They're not going to be thinking, oh, but because I've got a capo on the 3rd fret, that C chord's now an E flat. They're not. They're going, I know how to play this song, I'm now just going to move the whole thing. You can use a capo on a ukulele, but of course a capo can only take you up in pitch, not down. I could put a capo on my C-tuned soprano at the 2nd fret and I would have A, D, F sharp B. I could put it at the 3rd fret and then I'd have that really high E flat tuning, B flat, E flat, G, C. But I can't go downwards from there with a capo. But it's the same principle at work. As I mentioned, George Formby had ukes in different tunings, played different songs on them. One of the reasons he did that, no one would say he wasn't a good player, but lots of the things he played demanded open strings. Some of his techniques where you would pull off a string like that are very difficult to do if you're trying to play in the key of A flat or something like that. Whereas if he used a ukulele tuned up, he could play in C, he could play in D, he could play in E flat, and it meant also that if he was playing a song that had a band backing, an orchestral backing, he could match the key with them without having to figure out a way of doing what he did in a very difficult key to do it in. Cliff Edwards was very fond of this tuning, this lower tuning, and in fact he sometimes had ukes that went down a semitone below this, putting us in A, and right down to the G of baritone. Now if you were to buy the Cliff Edwards ukulele tutor books of the day, the ones with his face on, he'd be teaching you A, D, F sharp B tuning in the book, because that was the standard of the day. But when he performed, he often used lower tunings. It's a nice little theory of mine, I don't know how true it is, but as Cliff Edwards got older, his tunings tended to get lower. Could that be because as he aged, he found it harder to hit those high notes? But he wouldn't want to relearn all of the songs in a new key. So the easy way around that is simply to gradually take everything down in pitch, go from A, D, F sharp B, down to C, down to B flat, down to A, down to the baritone, which he did play towards the end of his career. You might also find that a ukulele will just feel and sound better in a particular tuning. So if you've got multiple ukuleles, you might want to try different ones in different tunings. That little sopranino one, that they're quite popular now, those really small ones, a lot of people want to tune those to C because it's going to be familiar and they're going to be able to play. But they really need to be tuned up high because they've got a small body and a short scale. And when you tune those up to A, D, F sharp B, or even higher than that, the very small ukuleles, they come to life. Likewise, a modern tenor can have quite a high string tension. That can make them difficult to play, but also a very high string tension can be pulling this top taut and killing the sound. And when you take off some of that tension, it allows the top to vibrate a little bit more freely, and just dropping a tenor down to B flat can suddenly bring it to life. So rather than putting heavier strings on to tune lower, you might just try just tuning it down with the existing strings and seeing if that little bit of release of tension on it lets it blossom and lets the sound come out even more brightly. The scale length of your ukulele is important. The ones I've got here start with the longest scale length is the baritone. Then there's this one, which is a little bit higher in pitch and a little shorter. Then my soprano, a bit shorter still. Then the little harmony soprano, a tiny bit shorter than that. And then the little camp uke, shorter still. So as they get smaller and shorter scaled, they work better at a different pitch. A shorter scale can be tuned up to a higher pitch with the same tension in the strings. So actually, tension-wise, this doesn't really feel any different to my harmony, which is a little longer and a little lower, and it doesn't feel that different to my Miller, which is a little lower and a little longer. Doesn't really feel any difference to the Boozy and Hawks, which again is a little lower and a bit longer again. This tiny little body probably wouldn't support a lower tuning, and if I put this in C with a low fourth, not only would I probably struggle with a slightly floppy feeling low fourth because of the shorter scale, but this tiny body probably wouldn't support that sound very well. It'd probably sound quite weak. Whereas this baritone with its big body can quite happily support a low fourth tuned all the way down to D and give me quite a nice bassy supported tone. So you might just find that one of your ukes just would feel better and sound better in a particular tuning. So if you've got a whole bunch, and I know ukulele players, quite a few ukulele players, I've got quite a few ukuleles. If you've got one that doesn't really get played as much because it just doesn't feel as nice or just doesn't seem to sound quite as good, try a different tuning. Maybe it wants to go up. Tuning a uke from C up to A, D, F sharp B can make it really bright and zingy. Maybe it wants to go down. A tenor ukulele tuned to C might feel quite tight. But the only way to find out for sure is to have a play around with it. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.